Can you imagine thinking you knew someone completely, only to discover they carried secrets darker than midnight itself? Picture this. A woman in white robes, hands folded in prayer, eyes cast downward in perfect submission. Sister Anne moved through the convent like a whisper, her footsteps silent on cold stone floors. For 7 years, the other nuns believed they knew her. Devoted, humble, broken by tragedy, but reborn in faith. They had no idea they were living alongside a storm wrapped in sanctuary cloth. Because Sister Anne wasn't just a nun, she was a woman whose past had been stolen, whose freedom had been shattered, whose very soul had been branded and sold. And on Christmas Eve, 1841, in the heart of New Orleans, that storm finally broke loose. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you're going to want to watch this entire video because what Sister Anne did on that holy night will leave you speechless. The most shocking part is coming at the end, and you won't believe how this story truly ends. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Royal Street, like secrets refusing to let go. New Orleans in December of 1841 was a city drunk on its own contradictions. Jazz spilled from tavern doors while church bells called the faithful to prayer. Carriages rolled past slave markets, where human flesh was bought and sold like sugar and cotton. And in the heart of this madness stood the convent of the Sacred Heart, its walls white as bone, its windows dark as judgment. Inside those walls, 23 nuns lived their lives in service to God. They rose before dawn, prayed until their knees bled, and slept on beds harder than coffins. Among them was Sister Anne, though that wasn't always her name. Once, long ago, she had been called something else entirely, something that mattered, something that belonged to her. But names, like freedom, were luxuries she'd learned to live without. The other sisters admired her devotion. Sister Catherine often whispered that Anne prayed with the intensity of someone who had seen hell and clawed her way back to heaven. Sister Margaret marveled at how Anne's hands never shook during communion, never wavered when she held the sacred bread. What they didn't know was that those same hands had once been chained. Those same fingers had picked cotton until they bled. That same mouth had screamed prayers not to God, but for death to come quickly. Sister Anne had arrived at the convent in 1834, during a winter so cold the Mississippi nearly froze. She came with a letter from Bishop Dubourg, explaining that she was a freed woman seeking sanctuary after losing her family to yellow fever. The nuns, moved by her story and her apparent calling, welcomed her without question. They gave her robes, a cell, a purpose. They gave her everything except the truth about who she really was, because Sister Anne had never been freed. She had escaped. Her real name was Amina. She had been born free in Haiti, daughter of a healer who spoke 3 languages and could read the stars like scripture. When she was 16, raiders came in the night. Her mother died fighting. Her father was shot trying to protect their home. And Amina, beautiful Amina with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that held lightning, was chained and dragged onto a ship bound for New Orleans. The plantation where they sold her belonged to the Thibodeau family, French Creoles, who owned half the sugar fields between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Monsieur Henri Thibodeau was a man who believed God had made him superior, and everyone else existed to serve his glory. His wife, Madame Celeste, was worse. She took pleasure in cruelty, found joy in breaking spirits, delighted in watching strong women crumble. For 3 years, Amina worked their fields. She harvested their cane, cleaned their house, served their meals. But she never broke. Not when they whipped her for looking too proud. Not when they locked her in the smokehouse for 3 days without food. Not even when Madame Celeste burned the star charts her mother had taught her to draw, claiming they were devil's work. What finally shattered her wasn't violence. It was love. His name was Baptiste. He belonged to a neighboring plantation, but sometimes their masters would loan workers to each other during harvest season. Baptiste had arms like oak branches and a smile that could warm December mornings. When he looked at Amina, she remembered what it felt like to be seen as human. When he held her hand in secret behind the sugar mill, she remembered what it felt like to be touched with tenderness instead of ownership. They met in shadows, loved in whispers, dreamed in fragments stolen between exhaustion and dawn. Baptiste spoke of running away together, of finding freedom in the swamps where maroon communities hid from the world. Amina began to hope again. She began to plan. She began to live. Then Madame Celeste found out. She discovered their secret the way cruel people always do, through betrayal and spite. Another slave, jealous or desperate for favour, whispered their love into her ear like poison. That evening, as Amina served dinner in the main house, Madame Celeste smiled with teeth sharp as broken glass. "I hear you've been busy," she said, cutting into her roast duck with deliberate precision. "Playing house with that boy from the Broussard place." Amina's hands trembled as she poured wine into crystal glasses. She said nothing, but her silence was confession enough. "Don't worry," Madame Celeste continued, her voice sweet as molasses and twice as dark. "I've already spoken with Monsieur Broussard. Such relationships are unhealthy for the discipline of our properties. Baptiste will be sold first thing tomorrow morning. To a sugar mill in Cuba, I believe. Lovely climate there, though I hear the work is rather intensive." The wine glass slipped from Amina's fingers. It shattered against the polished floor, red liquid spreading like blood across white marble. Madame Celeste laughed, a sound like breaking birds. "Clean that up," she ordered, "and don't worry about Baptiste. I'm sure he'll think of you often during his remaining months of life." That night, Amina didn't sleep. She sat by her small window, watching stars she could no longer read, holding pain she could no longer bear. By morning, Baptiste was gone, sold and shipped like cargo, taken from her life as easily as breath from lungs. The overseer told her with a grin that the boy had fought when they loaded him onto the ship. They'd had to break his hands to get him into the chains. Something inside Amina died that day. Not her spirit, that had been tested too many times to break so easily, but her willingness to accept, her ability to endure without action, her belief that suffering in silence was somehow noble. She began to plan differently now. Not escape, revenge. The Thibodeau family had a tradition every Christmas Eve. They would invite their wealthy friends for a grand feast, showing off their prosperity and their perfectly trained servants. Amina had served at these dinners for 3 years, moving invisible among white faces drunk on wine and their own importance. She knew their habits, their weaknesses, their schedules. She knew exactly when they would be most vulnerable, and she knew something else they didn't. Her mother hadn't just been a healer who read stars. She had been a woman who understood plants, who could brew teas that healed and potions that killed. Before the raiders came, she had taught Amina which roots brought sleep and which brought death. She had shown her daughter how to prepare medicines that could save lives or end them, depending on the dose and the intention. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter like a sacred flame. Knowledge that could burn down the world. As Christmas of 1841 approached, Amina began gathering what she needed. A handful of oleander leaves from the garden, dried and crushed to powder. Bitter almonds from the pantry, ground fine as dust. Seeds from the castor plants that grew wild behind the slave quarters, prepared with the precision her mother had taught her. Each ingredient collected in secret, hidden in small pouches sewn into her dress. Each one a promise whispered to Baptiste's memory. The other slaves noticed the change in her. She moved differently now, with purpose instead of resignation. Her eyes held something new, something that made even the overseers uncomfortable. When they looked at her too long, they felt like prey being studied by a predator who had learned patience. Sister Catherine would later say that something had shifted in Sister Anne during those final weeks of Advent. She prayed longer, worked harder, spoke less. Her devotions seemed to burn brighter, as if she was preparing for some great spiritual trial. The other nuns attributed it to the holy season, to the mysterious ways God worked in devoted hearts. They had no idea they were watching a woman prepare for war. Christmas Eve arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the very air was holding its breath. The Thibodeau mansion glowed with candlelight and crystal, filled with the laughter of 24 guests who had come to celebrate the birth of their Saviour while owning human souls. Amina moved among them like death in an apron, serving wine that sparkled like blood, offering delicacies that would soon become their final meal. She had spent days perfecting her plan. Each guest would receive a different dose, carefully calculated based on their size, their health, their level of cruelty. Madame Celeste would get the strongest concentration, enough to ensure she suffered before she died. Monsieur Henri would receive a slower poison, so he could watch his guests fall before joining them. The others would simply sleep and never wake. Their deaths as quiet as Baptiste's cries had been loud. As midnight approached and the guests raised their glasses in toast to the Christ child, Amina stood in the kitchen doorway, watching justice prepare to be served on silver platters. She thought of Baptiste's broken hands. She thought of her mother's burning star charts. She thought of all the names that had been stolen, all the lives that had been bought and sold like property. Tomorrow, the newspapers would call it a mysterious plague that struck down New Orleans society on the holiest night of the year. They would never suspect the quiet slave woman who had served their final meal with steady hands and empty eyes. They would never imagine that their victims had been killed not by disease, but by memory transformed into medicine, by love transformed into vengeance. But that's a story for the next part of this tale. Because what happened after the poison took hold, how Sister Anne escaped into the night and found sanctuary behind convent walls, that's when this story truly begins to burn. Make sure you stay tuned for part 2, where we'll discover how a woman who had killed 24 people convinced a house of God to shelter her, and what she was really planning all along. The most shocking revelation is still coming. Can you imagine believing you were safe in God's house, surrounded by holy women who had devoted their lives to peace, only to discover you were sleeping next to a woman who had watched 24 people die by her own hand? The nuns at the convent of the Sacred Heart had no idea that their most devoted sister carried the screams of the dead in her prayers. They thought her midnight weeping was spiritual ecstasy. They believed her trembling hands during communion were signs of divine favor. What they didn't know was that those same hands had measured poison with the precision of a pharmacist and the patience of a predator. Before we continue with this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Trust me, you need to watch this entire video, because what I'm about to reveal about Sister Anne's true plan will shock you to your core. The most devastating twist is coming at the very end, and it will change everything you think you know about this story. The morning after Christmas in 1841, New Orleans woke to whispers that travelled faster than plague. The Thibodeau mansion stood silent as a tomb, its windows dark, its doors sealed by authorities who couldn't explain what they'd found inside. 24 bodies lay scattered throughout the grand dining room like broken dolls, faces frozen in expressions of confusion and agony. Some had collapsed into their dessert plates. Others had tried to crawl toward the doors before the poison claimed them. Madame Celeste was found clutching her throat, her fingernails bloody from clawing at skin that would never breathe again. The newspapers called it divine judgment, the mysterious Christmas plague that struck down New Orleans society in their moment of greatest indulgence. Yellow fever, they speculated, though no fever had ever killed so quickly or so completely. Food poisoning from contaminated oysters, though the servants who ate the same dishes remained perfectly healthy. Some whispered of voodoo curses, of angry spirits rising from unmarked graves to claim their due. But in the slave quarters, where truth lived in whispers and secrets passed between calloused hands, they knew better. They had watched Amina disappear into the night like smoke, her white dress ghosting through cane fields under stars that finally smiled down on justice served cold. They said nothing to the authorities who questioned them. They claimed ignorance with the same skill their ancestors had used to survive shipholds and auction blocks. By dawn, Amina was 20 miles away, walking roads that led towards salvation or damnation. She no longer cared which. The blood of 24 people stained her soul, but her heart beat steady as a church bell. She had kept her promise to Baptiste. She had honored her mother's memory. She had proven that even the powerless could reshape the world when pushed beyond endurance. The transformation from killer to saint required more than just distance and time. It demanded rebirth, complete and absolute. Amina burned her blood-stained dress in a fire that lit the winter sky like prophecy. She scrubbed her skin until it bled, washing away not just the physical evidence of her crimes, but the very memory of who she had been. Then she walked into the Mississippi River and held herself underwater until her lungs screamed for mercy, baptizing herself in muddy water that tasted of death and redemption. When she emerged, gasping and shivering, she was no longer Amina the slave, Amina the poisoner, Amina the killer. She was Anne, a freed woman seeking God's grace after losing everything to tragedy. She practiced her new story until it felt true, rehearsed her grief until tears came naturally, perfected her humility until it sat on her shoulders like a familiar coat. The letter she carried to Bishop Dubourg was a masterpiece of deception, forged with skills learned from watching plantation clerks manage their human inventory. It told the tragic tale of Anne Fortier, daughter of freed parents who had died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1833. It spoke of her calling to serve God after losing her family, her desire to find peace in prayer and service. The bishop, moved by her apparent devotion and desperate for new vocants to serve his growing diocese, asked few questions. Within a week, she was kneeling before the altar of the Convent of the Sacred Heart, taking vows that burned like acid on her tongue. Poverty, chastity, obedience. She promised to own nothing, love no one, submit to everything. The irony was exquisite. A woman who had owned nothing her entire life, who had loved once and lost everything, who had never been allowed to disobey without facing the whip, now chose these restrictions freely. But freedom, she learned, wasn't about choice. It was about power, and power in a convent came through perfection. Sister Anne became the most devoted nun the convent had ever seen. She rose before the morning bells, praying in darkness until her knees left bloody stains on stone floors. She fasted until her ribs showed through her robes, claiming she needed less food than others, that hunger brought her closer to Christ's suffering. She worked without complaint, scrubbing floors until they gleamed, tending gardens until every flower bloomed in perfect rows, preparing meals with a precision that amazed the other sisters. They marveled at her discipline. They whispered of her holiness. They began to see her as touched by divine grace, chosen by God for special favor. What they didn't understand was that perfection was her camouflage, devotion her disguise, submission her strategy. Every prayer she muttered hid calculation. Every genuflection concealed planning. Every act of service was practice for what she really intended to accomplish. Because Sister Anne hadn't entered the convent seeking redemption. She had come seeking opportunity. The convent of the Sacred Heart wasn't just a house of prayer. It was the spiritual center for New Orleans' elite Catholic families. The wealthy sent their daughters there for education, their wives for spiritual retreats, their consciences for absolution. Every week brought visitors, donors, pilgrims seeking blessing from women who had sacrificed everything for God. Politicians knelt in the chapel. Plantation owners confessed their sins. Merchants donated fortunes to secure their place in heaven. Sister Anne watched them all. She memorized their faces, learned their names, studied their habits. She discovered which families had built their fortunes on slave labor, which men had separated families for profit, which women had taken pleasure in cruelty. She catalogued their sins like a scholar collecting specimens, patient and thorough, and absolutely merciless. The other nuns saw her interest in visitors as Christian charity. Sister Anne simply loved people, they said. She had such a gift for remembering names and faces, for making everyone feel welcome and heard. They didn't notice how her questions probed just a little too deeply, how her memory retained details that seemed insignificant, how her eyes held something harder than love when certain names were mentioned. For 7 years, she built her reputation and her knowledge. She became indispensable to the convent's operations, trusted with managing supplies, coordinating visits, preparing special meals for important guests. The Mother Superior began consulting her on matters of administration. The bishop himself praised her devotion during his annual inspections. She was being considered for promotion to Mother Superior of a new convent being established upriver. But Sister Anne had no interest in advancement. She was interested in completion. The garden behind the convent became her laboratory. Under the guise of growing herbs for cooking and medicine, she cultivated plants that her mother had taught her to recognize. Oleander bloomed beautiful and deadly along the chapel walls. Castor beans grew fat with poison in neat rows beside the tomatoes. Foxglove painted purple shadows among the roses, its leaves containing enough digitalis to stop a dozen hearts. She dried the plants in the convent's attic, grinding them to powder in the same mortar she used for communion bread. She tested dosages on the rats that plagued the grain stores, carefully noting which amounts killed quickly and which induced slow, agonizing death. She prepared tinctures that could be mixed into wine, powders that dissolved invisibly in soup, extracts that left no taste in blessed bread. The other sisters praised her dedication to the garden ministry. Sister Anne grew the most beautiful flowers, they said. Her vegetables were the largest and sweetest. Her herbs made everything taste divine. They had no idea they were admiring an arsenal disguised as agriculture, watching death being cultivated with the same care most people reserved for roses. By Christmas of 1841, 7 years after her arrival, Sister Anne was ready. The timing was perfect, almost divinely ordained. The convent would host its annual Christmas Eve celebration, welcoming the city's most prominent Catholic families for midnight mass and a blessed feast. 43 guests had confirmed their attendance, including plantation owners, slave traders, politicians, and their wives. The cream of New Orleans society gathered together in one room, trusting completely in the holiness of their surroundings and the innocence of the women serving them. They would eat food prepared by hands they believed belonged to a saint. They would drink wine blessed by someone they thought was touched by God's grace. They would receive communion from a woman they considered the purest soul in Louisiana. They had no idea they were walking into their own funeral. Sister Anne spent the final weeks of Advent in what the other nuns assumed was spiritual preparation. She prayed longer, worked harder, spoke even less than usual. Her devotion seemed to burn with supernatural intensity, as if she was preparing for some great spiritual trial. The Mother Superior told visiting bishops that Sister Anne was clearly being called to even higher service, that God was working something miraculous in her soul. They were right about the miraculous part. What they didn't understand was whose miracle was about to unfold. The most shocking part of this story isn't the poison, isn't the bodies, isn't even the years of patient planning. What will leave you speechless is what Sister Anne was really building toward, what she discovered about her own past that changed everything, and how this Christmas massacre was just the beginning of something far more devastating. Stay tuned. because the truth about Sister Anne will shatter everything you think you know about justice, revenge, and the price of freedom. Can you imagine believing you were witnessing the deepest spiritual devotion, watching a woman pour her entire soul into serving God, only to discover she was actually orchestrating the most calculated act of vengeance in Louisiana history? Picture the other nuns watching Sister Anne kneel for hours in the chapel, her lips moving in what they thought were prayers of divine ecstasy. They had no idea she was reciting the names of her victims, planning their deaths with the precision of a master craftsman and the patience of eternity itself. Before we reveal the most shocking part of this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I'm serious when I tell you that you absolutely must watch this entire video, because what I'm about to reveal about Sister Anne's true identity and her final plan will leave you speechless. The most devastating twist is coming at the very end, and it will change everything you thought you knew about this Christmas massacre. December 23rd, 1841. The convent of the Sacred Heart hummed with preparation like a hive before swarming. Candles were polished until they gleamed like captured starlight. Silver chalices were buffed to mirror brightness. The chapel floor was scrubbed on hands and knees until each stone reflected the stained glass windows above. Tomorrow would bring the most important celebration of the year, and every detail had to be perfect. Sister Anne moved through the preparations like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction. She assigned duties with care that seemed charitable, but was actually strategic. Sister Catherine would arrange flowers in the main hall, far from the kitchen. Sister Margaret would prepare the altar, her back to the dining preparations. Sister Louise would tend to the chapel's final cleaning, isolated in prayer and work. Each nun placed exactly where Sister Anne needed them, each task designed to keep them busy and distant from the real work happening in the convent's heart. The kitchen belonged to her now. For 7 years she had slowly, carefully, methodically taken control of every meal, every preparation, every ingredient that passed through those sacred walls. The other nuns trusted her completely. Sister Anne cooked with such devotion, they said. Her bread tasted like heaven itself. Her soups warmed not just the body but the soul. What they didn't know was that she had been practicing, not just cooking, but killing. Every meal she prepared was a rehearsal for tomorrow night. Every spice she measured was training for the precise dosages that would end 43 lives. Every smile she wore while serving was preparation for watching her enemies die. The guest list read like a catalogue of evil dressed in Sunday finest. Monsieur Philippe Broussard, the man who had bought Baptiste and shipped him to die in Cuban sugar mills. Madame Evangeline Trem, who collected slave children like exotic pets, separating them from their mothers for her amusement. Judge Armand Dufresne, who had signed the papers that made human trafficking legal and profitable. Senator Claude Marigny, who had written laws that made escape punishable by death. Each name on that list represented a thread in the web that had destroyed her life. Each family had profited from the system that had stolen her freedom, murdered her parents, enslaved her body, and killed the only man she had ever loved. Tomorrow night, they would all gather in one room, trusting in the sanctity of their surroundings and the purity of the women serving them. They would learn, too late, that sometimes God's justice came wearing a nun's habit. Sister Anne had spent months studying each guest's preferences, dietary restrictions, and medical conditions. Madame Broussard couldn't tolerate rich foods without becoming violently ill. Perfect. Judge Dufresne had a weak heart that fluttered with exertion. Excellent. Senator Marigny was diabetic, carefully managing his condition with diet and prayer. Ideal. She would tailor each death to each sin. The slave traders would die slowly, their bodies betraying them as they had betrayed so many others. The politicians would experience the helplessness they had legislated for others. The wives who had taken pleasure in cruelty would learn what suffering truly meant. But the centerpiece of her plan, the crown jewel of her vengeance, was reserved for the Thibodeau family. Yes, She had killed them 7 years ago on that first Christmas Eve. But their deaths had been quick, efficient, businesslike. She had been a different woman then, driven by fresh grief and raw fury. Now she was something else entirely, something colder, more patient, infinitely more creative. What the authorities had never discovered, what the newspapers had never reported, was that Monsieur Henri Thibodeau had a brother. Auguste Thibodeau owned plantations in Mississippi and had been traveling in Europe during the Christmas massacre that claimed his brother's entire family. He had returned to find his dynasty reduced to corpses and his inheritance soaked in blood. Auguste had spent 7 years hunting for his brother's killer. He had questioned slaves, bribed officials, hired investigators. He suspected the truth, that one of Henri's slaves had orchestrated the poisoning, but he could never prove it. The slave woman who had served that final meal had vanished like smoke, leaving no trace except the 24 bodies she had left behind. What Auguste didn't know was that his brother's killer was praying for his soul every morning in a convent chapel, preparing communion bread with the same hands that had measured poison, living under the protection of the very church he donated thousands to support. Sister Anne had been watching Auguste for years, studying him through the network of gossip and information that flowed through convent visitors. She knew his habits, his businesses, his plans. Most importantly, she knew he would attend tomorrow's Christmas Eve celebration. He came every year, she had learned, seeking spiritual comfort for grief that had never healed. He would find something very different than comfort. The irony was exquisite. Auguste Thibodeau, the brother of her first victims, would become the centerpiece of her second massacre. But this time, she wouldn't just kill him. She would reveal herself first. She would let him know exactly who she was, what she had done, and why his entire family had deserved to die screaming. Then she would watch the recognition dawn in his eyes before the poison claimed him too. But even that wasn't the most shocking part of her plan. No, what Sister Anne had discovered during her 7 years of patient investigation would rewrite the history of slavery in Louisiana. What she had learned about her own past would justify not just the deaths of 43 people, but the destruction of an entire system built on human suffering. The documents she had found, hidden in the convent's archives, papers donated by guilty consciences seeking absolution, revealed a truth so devastating that it changed everything she thought she knew about herself, her parents, and the night her freedom was stolen. Christmas Eve morning arrived with fog thick as sin, rolling off the Mississippi like the breath of ghosts. The convent bells rang clear and cold through the mist, calling the faithful to prepare their hearts for the celebration of Christ's birth. Inside the sacred walls, 43 guests would soon gather to worship the Prince of Peace, while Sister Anne prepared to serve them justice, seasoned with 7 years of patience. She stood in the kitchen as dawn broke, surrounded by ingredients that would become instruments of death. Oleander powder, fine as flour and twice as deadly. Foxglove extract, bitter as betrayal, but invisible in sweet wine. Castor bean oil, odorless and tasteless and absolutely fatal in the right dosage. Her hands didn't shake as she began the final preparations. Why would they? She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even before she knew it. Every prayer she had whispered in slavery had been leading to this altar of vengeance. Every lash she had endured had been training for this moment of reckoning. Every night she had wept for Baptiste had been preparation for the joy she would feel watching his killers die. The other nuns found her humming as she worked, her voice carrying ancient melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. They assumed she was singing hymns in the African dialect of her childhood, praising God in the language of her ancestors. They were wrong about the praising God part. What Sister Anne was really singing were the death songs her mother had taught her, melodies meant to guide spirits from this world to the next, songs that prepared the soul for its final journey, whether that journey led to heaven or somewhere much, much hotter. By evening, everything would be ready. The table would be set with china that gleamed like fresh bone. The wine would be poured from bottles that held liquid death. The communion bread would be blessed by hands that had learned to kill with the precision of a saint and the patience of a serpent. 43 guests would enter the convent seeking spiritual nourishment. They would receive something far more permanent. But the most shocking revelation hasn't been revealed yet. What Sister Anne discovered about her true identity, about why she had really been taken from Haiti, about the connection between her family and the very people she was about to kill, that truth will shatter everything you think you know about this story. Keep watching, because when you learn who Sister Anne really was and what had really been done to her family, you'll understand why this Christmas massacre was not just revenge, but cosmic justice finally finding its voice. Can you imagine thinking you knew everything about a person's pain, only to discover their suffering ran deeper than the roots of centuries-old cypress trees? Picture Sister Anne standing in that convent kitchen on Christmas Eve morning, her white habit pristine as fresh snow, her hands steady as stone as she measured death into porcelain bowls. The other nuns would have sworn they knew her heart, her history, her holy devotion. They had no idea they were watching a woman whose very existence was built on a lie so profound it would reshape everything they believed about justice, mercy, and the price of truth. But before we reveal the most devastating secret that Sister Anne carried, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. I'm telling you right now, you absolutely must watch this entire video, because what I'm about to reveal about Sister Anne's true identity and the real reason for this Christmas massacre will leave you completely speechless. The most shocking part is coming at the very end, and when you hear it, everything about this story will make perfect, terrifying sense. The fog that morning carried whispers from the past, voices that had been silenced but never forgotten. As Sister Anne moved through her final preparations, she could hear them all. Her mother's songs, drifting through steam that rose from boiling pots. Baptiste's laughter, echoing in the clink of silver spoons against porcelain. The cries of children sold away from their mothers, harmonizing with the scrape of her knife against cutting boards. She had been preparing more than poison these past 7 years. She had been preparing truth. The documents she discovered in the convent's archives weren't just random papers donated by guilty consciences. They were records, carefully preserved by priests who understood that someday, someone would need to know what had really happened. Bills of sale written in elegant script, shipping manifests signed with flourishes, letters between plantation owners discussing their human property like livestock at market. But buried deeper in those yellowed pages, Sister Anne had found something that changed everything. A letter dated 18 years ago, written in handwriting she recognized like her own heartbeat. Her mother's script, flowing and proud, addressed to Bishop Dubourg himself. The letter that would explain why she had really been taken from Haiti, why raiders had come for her family specifically, why her mother had died fighting not just for their lives, but for secrets that could destroy the very foundation of Louisiana's slave economy. Her mother hadn't just been a healer who read stars. She had been a record keeper, a woman who documented every ship that brought stolen people to New Orleans, every plantation that bought them, every family torn apart for profit. She had maintained a network of informants, free people of color who worked as servants in wealthy homes, who overheard conversations and copied documents and passed information through channels that stretched from Haiti to Cuba to the Mississippi Delta. The letter revealed that her mother had been planning to expose everything. Names, dates, financial records that would prove how deeply the Catholic Church itself was invested in human trafficking. How donations from plantation owners had built churches while children were sold at auction. How bishops had blessed ships that carried stolen souls. How the very altar where Sister Anne now prayed had been paid for with blood money. But someone had discovered her mother's plan. Someone had sent those raiders not just to capture slaves, but to silence a woman who knew too much. Someone who had everything to lose if her mother's records ever saw daylight. That someone had a name that would be sitting at the head table tomorrow night, raising a toast to the birth of Christ while wearing jewels bought with the blood of innocence. Auguste Thibodeau hadn't just been Henri's brother, he had been the architect of the entire operation, the man who coordinated between plantation owners and ship captains, who arranged for inconvenient witnesses to disappear, who made sure that records of the most illegal transactions never made it into official ledgers. Can you imagine thinking revenge was about ending lives, only to discover it was about revealing truth that would outlive every soul it touched? Sister Anne stood in that convent kitchen, surrounded by the bodies of 43 people who had built their fortunes on stolen freedom. And for the first time in her life, she smiled without pretense. Not because death brought her joy, but because finally, the silence had been broken. Her mother's records, hidden for 18 years in the convent's own archives, would now see daylight. The church that had sheltered her would have to face its own complicity. And Auguste Thibodeau's dying breath had carried a confession that would reshape Louisiana forever. Sister Anne didn't just serve poison that Christmas Eve. She served truth, seasoned with patience, and delivered with the precision of someone who understood that real justice isn't about ending stories, but about making sure they're finally told.